Hi again then guys, and welcome to of course another breakdown of one of the 1.32 vehicles, and this one I've talked about before here on the channel in general. You know my thoughts if you've been around on the channel for a while. I don't hate this car, it's just one of those cars which I don't understand why people lose their minds over it so much, because there are certain people, in fact quite a few people, who genuinely do seem to absolutely love the Ferrari Dino. Now that's not to say it doesn't have merit. In fact, I would say the Dino has a ton of merit, and that's the whole point of these reviews. It goes beyond my personal taste to give recommendations of cars that are or are not worth buying, and if they are, what are they worth using for? What kind of racing? What kind of driver enjoyment? So from that point of view, of course I can appreciate the Dino, I just don't love it. Now as far as its overall ability, it's safe to say it's unlike any other Ferrari in the whole series. Not only is it the slowest, but it's a completely different driving experience and purchasing experience. Or at least it was, and that's the interesting change, because in GT6, if I recall correctly, I think this was 90,000 credits. So, in other words, by far the cheapest Ferrari. Now though, well now, just like the Porsche, just like the Shelby GT350 also in this pack, because of real world prices most likely, it's a lot more expensive. And when I say a lot more, I mean a lot more expensive. Half the price of an Enzo. And when you put it that way, well, that doesn't sound like great value. Do I want two Dinos or an Enzo? Now, maybe some people would choose the Dinos, I have no doubt, but even as a classic fan, I would have to say I'd choose the Enzo in that circumstance. However, what can it do for 500,000? Well, the car straight off the bat has a ton of potential for Blue Moon Bay, for instance. I haven't personally tested it there yet, but it can be tuned up into N300, so I'll give it a test, see what it can run. I've heard reasonably good things from other people, so we'll see. But as far as its baseline performance, just straight out of the crate, what do you actually get from the Dino? Because typically Ferraris in old or new form will have stuff like these big Boxer 12s or screaming V8s in the case of something like a Scuderia or a 458 Italia. So what does this one have? Well, it's a 2.4. So no way near what you'd typically expect from a Ferrari, but it's a completely different kind of Ferrari, as I said. To me, this has always been more like the Porsche Boxster of Ferrari, that more affordable, almost entry-level model, which is in a very Mazda MX-5 kind of way, even though, of course, this came out before that, is more for the enjoyment of driving rather than just being the fastest thing out there. And from that point of view, again, I can certainly respect what the car is trying to achieve. Now, of course, it was named after Enzo's son, who died, Dino Ferrari, and it's an interesting little ode to his son. Maybe his son enjoyed stuff like this, relatively modest powered cars that are better through corners. In fact, in some ways, you could kind of call this the Ferrari Lotus, because it's very Lotus-esque. Small, compact, sleek, rounded, soft-looking, relatively lightweight, not a huge amount of power, but doesn't necessarily need it either. That's very Lotus in its approach. Now, as far as the rest of the specs, we already said it's got a 2.4 litre engine. You push in 191 horsepower, so of course N200. You can detune it to N100, and that's something that you might want to bear in mind. As far as torque, you're looking at a very impressive, actually, 166. And you're probably wondering why am I saying that that's impressive? It wouldn't usually be. But the reason why I'm saying that's impressive is because for a Ferrari, if you compare that to the power in terms of just a ratio rather than a specific number, that's actually much more torquey in comparison to power than a Ferrari would typically be. If you look at something like a 430 or a Scuderia or a 488, they will typically have a good, say, 100 to 150 pound-feet of torque less than its equivalent power. So say 500 horsepower or so, but about 380 pound-feet, that kind of thing. And that goes for their V8s and also most of their V12s. They have far less torque than power, these high-revving, almost Formula Car for the road style engines, which of course, given the history of the brand, makes sense. For the Dino, it's actually got quite a lot of torque in comparison, 166 pound-feet to 191 horsepower. That's a pretty good conversion. Now, as far as the weight, funnily enough, it actually weighs exactly the same as another car in this pack. And if I asked you which one, you probably wouldn't guess. The Integra. The Ferrari Dino weighs exactly the same as the Honda Integra Type R, 1,080 kilos. Now, when you put it that way, you could view that in two ways. Either that's really good for the Honda Integra, or really bad for the Ferrari. So which is it? Well, don't worry, it's really good for the Integra, because the Ferrari definitely isn't heavy. It's just that the Honda is ridiculously lightweight for what it is. Now, for the Ferrari, having that kind of weight makes sense. Of course it's going to weigh barely more than a tonne, because it's a two-door, two-seater, small classic, with a pretty small engine. It's not lugging around this big V12 or a V8, it's a modest Ferrari. Not exactly a poor man's Ferrari, but a more modest one for sure. Now, as far as the horsepower per tonne, it's 177, which is reasonable. Again, lower than an Integra, for instance, but not bad for a car that's this old at least. Now, as far as what it can do, its ability, the way it performs, the handling on the Dino will take some getting used to. It's a little bit floaty, it's almost like driving a small speedboat, but in kind of a neutral way. It's not great, but it's not bad as far as stock handling goes. It's nimble, but it's also quite slippery. It likes to step its tail out, and it almost has kind of a boat tail visual design if you look at it from the side, so that's not too surprising. And in some ways it actually feels quite like driving an Alfa Romeo Spider from back in the day, which again has a similar shape. In terms of competitive ability though, well, of course it's got plenty, and this is, I believe, the first Ferrari in the game that you can actually use in N200 if you want to, or even of course in N100. I believe there might be one or two other Ferraris that you might be able to use in N300, I can't recall, maybe not. I know you can in N400 though, stuff like the F40 even. But this one nicely bridges the gap, and again, that brings me back to why this car was so good in GT6. I would say the two best things about the Dino in Gran Turismo 6 were the pricing compared to all other Ferraris, and the fact that it was so much less powerful, so it was useful in slower classes. One of those things is still the case. In fact, you could argue even more so now with the N-Class system rather than performance points. The other, well, of course, used car prices dictate, but the simple fact is, of course, it's not as affordable. 90,000 compared to 500,000 is a huge jump. But if you are a Ferrari fan, if you want a fast but relatively low-powered classic sports car, there's not a huge amount of rivalry for this one. You've got what? Stuff like the Mercedes Gullwing, if that was brought back. Currently in the game, you've got the Toyota 2000 GT, maybe the Jag E-Type at a push, but not a huge amount of competition in that category, at least not without down-tuning them. So again, the Ferrari's pretty good for that kind of thing. Ultimately, it's not going to be as easy as driving something like an NSX or a Subaru 22B or an Integra in N200, but for those who like the classic alternative, it is definitely worth a look. And it's expensive, but it is a Ferrari, and it's a very collectible one. So for those who are Dino fans, I think you'll love it just as much as you did, if not more so, than in GT6, and if you're not, it's worth a try. As far as pricing goes, you might want to buy it a little bit later on in the pack though, unless you plan to do N200 racing all the time. But that's it for my thoughts. Of course, we'll cover a tune for this one later on in the week, most likely, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.